Fear is primal, a survival mechanism wired into the very fabric of our brains. Did you know that chronic fear can alter your DNA, reshaping your very biology for generations? It leaves behind a legacy, not only for the one who feels it, but for those yet to come. Tonight, we continue the entwined stories of Jacob, the haunted writer unraveling his fears in the seclusion of his snowy retreat, and Elias, the brooding detective confronting horrors that defy comprehension. Fear, it seems, has many faces, and each one grows darker than the last. The soft knock on Jacob's cabin door echoed through the storm. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment he wondered if it had been the wind, but the sound came again. Deliberate, patient. Gathering his courage, Jacob stood and approached the door. His hand hovered over the handle, hesitating before he finally opened it. There was no one there. The storm raged on, snow swirling violently in the wind. He glanced down and saw a package resting on the step, half buried in the snow. Jacob stepped outside, the cold biting through his thin sweater, and picked it up. When he looked around, the faint outline of a figure vanished into the trees. Heart pounding, he brought the package inside and set it on the desk. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with twine. His fingers shook as he opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper folded neatly inside. He unfolded it, his pulse quickening as he read the words scrawled in messy handwriting. "What do you fear the most?" Jacob sank into his chair, staring at the note. His gaze shifted to Elias's journal, still open on the desk. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the book and turned the page, desperate for answers. December 23rd, 1949. Elias's journal. Elias stood at the edge of the bridge, the icy wind cutting through his coat. Below him, the river churned, thick with chunks of ice. It wasn't the first time he'd been called to this spot, and he doubted it would be the last. A young woman had jumped, or at least that was the official story. Her body had been found downstream, her eyes wide open and her lips curled into a faint, almost peaceful smile. But something didn't sit right with Elias. The woman's roommate had described her as terrified in the days leading up to her death. She'd spoken of whispers in the dark, of shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Elias had dismissed it at first, chalking it up to paranoia or mental illness. But now, standing on the bridge where she'd supposedly taken her life, he wasn't so sure. Jacob paused, his cigarette burning low between his fingers. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't. He'd heard something similar in one of his interviews. Pulling out his laptop, he scrolled through his notes until he found it. A woman named Caroline who had described a presence in her home that seemed to grow stronger at night. "It's like the darkness itself is alive," she said, her voice trembling. Jacob felt a chill crawl up his spine. He closed the laptop and returned to the journal, unable to shake the feeling that these stories, his and Elias's, were connected in ways he couldn't yet understand. December 23rd, 1949. Elias's journal. The woman's apartment was eerily quiet save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Elias moved through the small space carefully, his flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The roommate had given him a key, along with a whispered warning. "Be careful." It's still there. Elias had rolled his eyes at the time, but now standing in the apartment he wasn't so sure. There was a heaviness in the air, a palpable tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He stopped in front of a mirror hanging in the hallway. It was large, ornate, and old, the kind of thing you'd expect to find in an antique shop. As he stared at his reflection, something shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but then he saw it clearly. His reflection smiled, his own face grinning back at him, though he hadn't moved a muscle. Elias stumbled back, his heart racing. He drew his gun instinctively, pointing it at the mirror. The smile disappeared, replaced by his usual scowl. He lowered the weapon slowly, his hands trembling. Jacob's heart pounded as he read. He reached for the glass of whiskey and downed it in one gulp, the burn grounding him momentarily. What was happening to Elias? What was happening to him? The journal was becoming more than just a story, it felt like a warning. He closed the book and stood up, pacing the small cabin. Outside, the storm had intensified, the wind howling like a living thing. Jacob stopped in front of the window, staring out at the endless expanse of white. And then, just for a moment, he thought he saw something move among the trees. He shook his head, telling himself it was just the wind. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. December 24th, 1949, Elias's journal. Elias didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his small apartment, the mirror from the woman's hallway propped up against the wall. He didn't know why he'd brought it back with him. Something about it felt important, like it held answers he couldn't yet see. As the hours dragged on, Elias found himself drawn to the mirror. He sat in front of it, staring at his reflection, waiting for it to move again. But it didn't. Instead, he heard something else. A whisper, faint and distant, like wind through the trees. "What do you fear most?" The question sent a shiver through him. He turned away from the mirror, shaking his head. He wasn't afraid. He couldn't be. Fear was a weakness, and he'd spent his entire life learning to overcome it. But now, sitting alone in the dimly lit room, he wasn't so sure. Jacob's hand trembled as he turned the page. He glanced at the note once more, its ominous question burning into his mind. Then, without warning, the candle on his desk flickered violently before extinguishing completely. The cabin was plunged into darkness. From somewhere outside, the soft knock returned once, twice, 3 times. It wasn't the wind. Jacob's breath hitched as he backed away from the door, clutching the journal tightly to his chest. Fear has a way of finding us, no matter how far we run or how well we hide. Jacob's journey into the shadows is just beginning, and Elias's battle with the unknown grows darker with every step. What connects these two men? And what new horrors will they uncover as they confront their deepest fears? Stay tuned for episode 5 of Shadows of the Mind, where the line between reality and nightmare blurs further. Until then, remember, fear is always closer than you think.